We got a great interview for you guys today. It's with Professor Ramesh Srinivasan. I love giving your credentials because I'm amused by how deep they are. He's now a professor in information studies at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies and Design Media Arts at UCLA. Not a big deal, got a BS in industrial engineering from Stanford University, MS in media arts and sciences from MIT, PhD in design studies from Harvard University, then did Doctoral Research Fellow at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, obviously, and then was a lecturer at University of California, San Diego in Department of Ethnic Studies. Apparently has done some studying. Okay. Now, Ramesh, we've talked before, and it was great conversation.
Yeah.
And I know that after you and I talked both on air and off air, you went to Egypt again to study what was happening there, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. And I've got to get caught up on it. I don't know as much as I wanted to, so I love that we're about to have this conversation.
Totally. I've never been in a part of the world where there's been more activity, more turbulence, and more possibilities that are both positive as well as highly dystopic as Egypt. I've been working there for the past 3 years, primarily in the summers. As I was telling you offline, one of the greatest honors was by the end of this past summer, before the military coup and the protests that preceded that a number of activists who I deeply admire, who I've been working with for 3 years, including people who are highly influential within Egypt, as well as internationally known, asked me to actually come to them and say, what are you learning about us? Like, how can we sort of organize ourselves in ways to continue to push against some of these coercive forms of power that have been disenfranchising us for so many years?
So I want to go to what happened, and it's funny because as I was watching, because of our earlier conversations, as I was watching what was unfolding in Egypt this time around, there was the original revolution, and then of course the military came in, right? So that's what I mean by this time around. I thought to myself from time to time, I can't wait to speak to Ramesh to figure out what's actually happening, right? So we've discussed the earlier revolution, right? Now the military steps in to get rid of Morsi. Let's start there, okay? So first of all, let me ask this elementary question. What Mohamed Morsi was doing when he was the head of the Egyptian government, was it abusive of the process? Or do you think that he was simply exercising the maximum amount of power that he was allowed to exercise as the democratically elected leader of Egypt?
So President Morsi, as you said, was absolutely a democratically elected leader of Egypt, and that's partly because many of the activists who organized couldn't really find the right way to generate political parties. They actually found the entire system to be sort of false in its promise, and they saw their game as a long-term game. So he was democratically elected. However, he did abuse his power in multiple ways that actually forced the loss of his legitimacy, in my opinion. It's really interesting, in the run-up to the protests, which happened on June 30th, what was called the Tamarod, or rebel campaign, President Morsi used the term legitimacy several times. I was sitting in Tahrir Square. There were probably about 100,000 people around me, and there was a video with him giving a speech to the nation. And every 20 or so seconds that he would speak, people would just chant and roar disapprovingly about his legitimacy. So he lost his legitimacy primarily on two sets of issues. First was there were a set of presidential protests because many of the promises that Morsi had made had not been delivered. So people had protested outside of the Tahadea, or the presidential palace, which is kind of in New Cairo. And the protesters were attacked. Some people were killed. Many people were brutally assaulted. So that is something that already violates legitimacy of any sort of democratic regime. The second was the continuous use of divisive rhetoric when it came to populist politics. So what do I mean by that? The Shias, religious minority among Muslims in Egypt, were often blamed when problems would occur. Morsi and his people, or at least the people around Morsi, would often use that type of rhetoric. The Coptic Christians, who were 10% minority of the country, but had been in Egypt since the beginning, they were often sort of put under the bus by Muslim Brotherhood official rhetoric. I had some friends who were activists who were doing a blog called Muslim Brotherhood in English, and what they would do is translate the content the Muslim Brotherhood would put out in Arabic, which is far more divisive, far more heated, far more hateful, one would say, and translate that to English to actually show the actual types of divisive rhetoric, partisan politics, but much worse, that the Morsi regime was engaging in.
That's interesting, Ramesh. But let me challenge you on that because, look, I'm no fan of the Muslim Brotherhood. I wish somebody else had won the elections, but I'm not the Egyptian people. They won, right? Divisive rhetoric, we got divisive rhetoric over here, right?
Sure.
We've got divisive rhetoric everywhere.
Sure.
And so, yes, it might have been a different level. I understand that, right? But, here Peter King, a congressman from New York, did hearings on whether we can trust Muslim Americans. That's pretty divisive.
Absolutely.
Look, I would hope that he would lose his next election, but I don't know that we impeach him over that. Right? And so, and as far as, the legitimacy, et cetera, I feel like that it needs a higher barrier before you say, hey, listen, this person needs to be removed from office. And again, I had mixed feelings at the time because I'm not in their camp, and so I got a little excited that Muslim Brotherhood was leaving, but then you wonder, is it really legitimate to throw them out? So because especially when the military does it, I mean, you want to talk about legitimacy, what gives them the right to be able to exercise that power? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, the last point of what you just said is absolutely correct. I mean, the military was not necessarily seen as the step-in solution by the vast majority of the activists who were organizing the June 30th protests. They saw President Morsi stepping down, and they even were able to, some of them at least, were even open to the idea of dramatic reforms in the governance structure, which President Morsi himself offered before but didn't deliver on. People like Mohamed al-Baradei, who's more of a kind of a secular liberal, could come into power, but with some level of actual force behind his office post rather than being a figurehead. So the military's intrusion into all of this probably could have been predicted, but was sort of the worst nightmare for many people who were activists who were organizing against the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, many of the people that were responsible for organizing those protests have very much protested against the ways in which the Muslim Brotherhood have been vilified as a terrorist organization, the ways folks within the Brotherhood have been thrown in jail, and even worse in some cases, many people you just haven't heard from again. I was at a press conference run by some of the major folks in the Brotherhood, very sophisticated, cosmopolitan-seeming people, spoke very good English and so on. And they were saying all the right things, and it was crazy because it was just a couple days before the protests, and they said, that's fine, people have the right to protest, but we're not going anywhere. So I agree with you in the sense that, legitimacy should have a strong barrier to it. I don't necessarily agree that barrier wasn't surpassed in Egypt when you attack your own people, kill your own people, and I understand that happens in other regimes as well.
Right, I was going to say Ukraine, and you could name, at least half a dozen places where that has happened. So let's talk about it first in a kind of a theoretical way in that what's supposed to happen when you lose that kind of legitimacy? So, for example, take the Ukraine. What should happen in that circumstance?
Yeah, in that case, actually, what President Morsi should have actually done was actually make serious concessions and actually respond to the fact that 30 million people in this country had signed a signature that moved virally, whether it was partly online but primarily offline, people just with photocopies saying Morsi should go. So when the president has 30 million out of an 85 million person country, that doesn't even mean the petitions reached every single person. Say it reached 50 million and 30 million signs saying Morsi should go, there needs to be a serious response to that. President Morsi basically just blamed the boogeyman every time that happened.
No, I'm with you. That part I find relatively easy. Of course they should respond in a democracy because they don't represent just the people who voted for them. Whether they've even kept those people as supporters is a different question, right? But they should respond to the whole country and certainly to legitimate protesters. But if they don't, as Morsi didn't, then who is supposed to act?
So the people acted, right? And of course the people acted, the people in Egypt protested for a set of visions and ideals. And perhaps this is something that, we can critique and say that they were unrealistic about this all. But the reason they put themselves in such harm's way and did such miraculous things and wonderful things back in 2011 was for a vision that they had that was a more democratically legitimate government. And President Morsi wasn't living up to that. So they were determined to keep going with that. But I totally agree with you. The military was right behind the barrier. They cut a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood, and they exploited the situation because they always hated the Brotherhood. They were looking for an excuse to basically get rid of him.
So did they co-opt the movement? I know before we got started you were talking about the helicopters. Tell me about that.
Yeah, this was really striking. I mean, the protests were actually, there were calls in the Tamarod rebel protest in front of the presidential palace. But of course, because there was so much of a buildup, I mean, I was on the subways, walking through Cairo, walking around the country, people would be yelling at each other about their different opinions about these protests. So everybody knew something major was going to happen. The protests were in front of the palace, but they just virally spread all over the country. And of course, there were thousands and thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands eventually, in Tahrir. The scary thing was just on the second day of protests, very quickly, helicopters, military helicopters, which one would think were there to maybe protect this situation from turning into some sort of civil war, were flying over the protesters saying, "We have solidarity with you all," dropping Egyptian flags. And the response of the protesters, despite the history and this really relates to the concern about basic subsidies and wealth, the military is seen as providing those, despite the big myth around that. People cheered, when they saw those flags, in their hands.
It's a great piece of propaganda, by the way, to drop the flags.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. And so that were the organizers that you've talked to dismayed by that?
Deeply dismayed, deeply concerned by that. They were writing articles in international media outlets such as The Guardian, such as on Al Jazeera. And they're highly active, of course, on social media platforms. They were deeply concerned that this would be rapidly co-opted by the military. It did not take away from what they were trying to achieve necessarily. They really believed in the protest. They believed it was the right thing to do because Morsi wasn't going to budge. And in fact, he was engaging in highly violent sorts of actions and rhetoric. But they were hoping that there would be such a popular groundswell that no sort of institutional force could just rapidly co-opt this.
But again, to the point of, well, what did they want to happen? Because if the military doesn't step in and Morsi says, "I'm not going," what happens next?
Right. So militaries often do step in coup situations, but they step in simply to stabilize the situation. That's not how this military functions. They're called the macaroni military, and that's a term that's used in derisive ways by activists and people across Egypt because they own all the macaroni factories in Egypt.
That's funny. Okay.
So the military shouldn't be measured as a force with an army per se in sort of that standard armed forces way, but they need to be understood as a neoliberal force. They're a force that owns tons of property. They're all billionaires. They basically control the sort of, they're the hand behind everything in Egypt.
So let me step back for a second. How tied was Mubarak to the military? Were they separate entities, or was he simply the head of that larger entity? Not
head, but part of it, absolutely. So that what we're talking about was what used to be called the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. That was the group that stepped in right after the 18 days of protest after January 25th. But Mubarak and the military, while the military, sort of said, "Okay, Mubarak, it's time for you to step down," they maintained their own, hegemony. They maintained their own power. So what these activists, just to respond to your question, really were hoping for was that the military would keep the peace, but then interim individuals could come in and form some sort of transition government, and then they could set a date for free and fair elections. Mm-hmm. That was what they were hoping for. There was a constitutional drafting assembly that didn't really have that much legitimacy to it because Morsi was sort of delaying that process. But they were basically hoping the military would respond to this groundswell of people because it was another massive, massive set of protests. I wrote a piece on Al Jazeera that came out just a week after these protests, observing what was happening there. And I was concerned at the very end of the piece that I wrote that this would be co-opted. Seeing those helicopters told me these guys might step in and they might take power. And because they have so much money, they can subsidize basic subsidies that were, the prices were going through the roof, like gas prices. I've talked about the price of tomatoes before, the price of various forms of fuel. So they could subsidize that and artificially make the economy look a little bit better, so working class people would respond positively to the military in this case.
Oh, that's super interesting. Did they inflate the prices while Morsi was in power to cause him trouble and then bring him down after they took power?
They simply didn't support Morsi. in the ways that counted. So because the economy is so much in the tubes in Egypt, the prices just shot through the roof, and the military didn't step in to support that. This all helped, build the populism of these massive, spontaneous, viral protests. They were planned, but they were very viral and very spontaneous.
I love when we get to something super interesting like that I didn't know. Okay, so now basically, I guess what the protesters wanted was a Turkish-style coup, where the military comes in and does a caretaker kind of government for a little while and then hands it back off to a democracy. Now, that hasn't really happened.
No. In fact, my very good friend was here in Los Angeles. I had deep dish pizza with him a month ago. His name is Ahmed Meir. He's the founder of the April 6th movement, which is a major youth-driven movement that called for the initial protest back in 2011. This guy was protesting back to 2004. He's been thrown in jail. He's been in solitary confinement. 3-year prison term sentence that he was just put under. Allah Abdel Fattah, who's one of the most internationally known bloggers, a major human rights activist, a major voice of reason, someone very connected with the labor movement in the country. He's been thrown in jail indefinitely. The activists, especially the intelligentsia, but also the people who have the passion and the grit and know how to work with masses of people, those guys are getting taken out right now.
So the military comes in, and then there's the Muslim Brotherhood protests. And you talked about how Morsi, who's the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, lost legitimacy because he cracked down on protests and some people died. Well, the military cracked down much harder on Muslim Brotherhood protests, and a lot of people died.
Yes.
So by that logic, certainly the military lost legitimacy at that point.
Sure.
So, but nonetheless, they continued to possess the weapons, so they didn't much care apparently. So where do we stand with the government today, and what do you think is the people's reaction to that?
Yeah, power is a dirty game. Power is about how much you have. Whether you got the guns, whether you got the cash, whether you got the land. And there's one organization or institution, if you want to call it, in Egypt that has all three of those, and that's the military. There's been a lot of work that's dissected the military and looked at the history of the military, dating back to Nasser, and the military coup of the monarchy. So. It's a long game. No, certainly many of my friends in Egypt are sad. They're upset. I am friends with many of these people on Facebook, and I follow them on Twitter, and they seem very despondent about what has happened. But they also know that they've pulled this off now for 3 straight years. They've created a situation which is dynamic, where any number of outcomes could occur. Yes, the military's intrusion probably should have been the most predictable in retrospect, but they're looking at the long game. They're trying to look at, they have been very successful, Cenk, in the past at organizing campaigns to discredit the military on very particular issues. They were able to stop military trials of civilians. They were able to show the military's false promises and lies back when the military was in power, right after Mubarak was deposed. They have a campaign that you may find interesting called Askar Kazebum, which is translated in English as "the military are liars." And the way that campaign worked was in a country still with not a lot of internet access. They were distributing video cameras and projectors all over the country and telling people in your own communities, film lies of the military. Just videotape it, $100 maximum. Video cameras, and project those videos on your own brick and mortar walls of your own communities.
Wow.
And that's really cool because people see the lies of the military. It's viral, you can't control it, and people see the lies of the military created by their friends and neighbors on their own walls.
So that's super sophisticated. Who would fund a thing like that? Because you need a little bit.
You do need some. So they were supported centrally in Cairo. They definitely are very careful not to take any, liberal American or Western money at all, because that's the easiest way to discredit yourself in the Arab world.
My guess is they're not going to want to reveal their funders because those funders will wind up in jail fairly quickly.
Heavily. And the other thing that's really important to remember is that everybody was against the Muslim Brotherhood. Everyone set that up. I'm not even sure if it was purposely in such a way as to make the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi fail. The media, the private media, which is hardcore capitalist, satellite, neoliberal media was completely against Morsi. They have not critiqued the military in heavy ways since. They did not really critique Mubarak when he was in power, but once Morsi came into power, these activists had their best friends, who they were very wary of, in these forms of satellite media. So the satellite media tend to be owned by private industrialists and wealthy people who are connected, obviously, with the military in very close ways.
So I want to get back to social media and how they communicate. That's really, really interesting. But let's finish up with the state of affairs and where they are now. So what is the military saying now? Are they like, that's it, we're staying, sad day for everybody, Egypt will be run by the military forever? Or do they have some sort of...
They never speak that way. They're far too intelligent for that, but they are very good at exploiting populism. So, everybody hated the Morsi regime. Everybody was really, people were very unhappy with the state of economic affairs. People were unhappy with the vilification of minorities to some extent. But primarily it was an economic set of grievances. So what the military has done is, in some cases, used extremely abrasive language when they know it will work in a populist sense with Egypt, like the Muslim Brotherhood were somehow labeled all of a sudden as a terrorist organization. So that's just sort of like highly ironic, given that the military cut this deal with the Brotherhood to bring the Brotherhood into power in the past, when the Brotherhood won the parliamentary elections, the presidential elections in the second round. So there's those kinds of things. There's abrasive rhetoric, but then there's also rhetoric about how, yes, we will have parliamentary elections. Yes, we will have at some point,
So they lay it out as indefinite. Like, we will, we just don't know when yet. Stay with us.
We are the protector of the Egyptian people. Masri. We are, Masri is like of Egypt. It's another word for Egypt. We are Egypt. Egypt is us. Every young man joins the military and the armed forces. We are the blanket of Egypt. We are what Egypt is. We are the flag of Egypt, right? It's very hard to fight against that, especially if you're someone who's working class and can't afford anything unless these guys are in power.
So that's really interesting. So the activists then have to hope for new elections at some not well-defined, period of time later, and hope that they bring democracy back, but it's largely up to the military.
I think the activist move is social movement based rather than election based at this point. It's about campaigns like this campaign, like the military are liars type of campaigns. It's about trying to cut down and register some upticks against the military around particular issues, with the hope that that will eventually bring enough of a popular consensus towards some sort of alternative. What the military tried to do is not only co-opted working class people and poor protesters, but they tried to co-opt kind of the reasonable spokespeople of the sort of, maybe not the hardcore, but middle activist movement, like Mohamed el-Baradei. The military named him as a sort of, like a vice president or some kind of minister in their interim regime. And he washed his hands off it once he saw this bloodbath that was happening with respect to the Brotherhood. So that was another technique of co-optation. Keep your enemies closer by pretending like they're your friends.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's two more things before we move on to social media. One is, so can we conclude, bottom line, Muslim Brotherhood has largely been wronged here? Not necessarily in the removal of Morsi in the first place, but certainly in what's happened since?
I don't think there's any question about that. Yeah, and it's very sad. We don't really... because remember, the Brotherhood have paid with blood historically, not just in 2011 and not just now. Historically, they were the only sort of legitimate opposition to this series of military plutocratic regimes. And they've been around since 1919. And I've actually read, there's great work on the histories of the Brotherhood. And their method of organization was street-based culture, specifically around the mosque. They realized that was the other kind of rallying point for Egyptian people was Islam. And they used that, and they had all these techniques of helping poor people and so on. So, there are many Brotherhood folks that I met who were more moderate. Many of the youth who were part of the Brotherhood kind of dissociated themselves from the Brotherhood when Morsi became a little more extreme. And there's something within that as a sort of oppositional force that it's sad to see gone.
Yeah. So, and then let me do one summary here, which is so Mubarak, was of course not the head of the military literally, right?
No.
But was connected to the military heavily when he was in charge. When it got to the point that the military thought there was too high a price to pay to keep him, said, hey, let's move you along. Let's bring in someone else who's gonna have basically the same deals, but not have you around. Mubarak didn't want to play along. He got moved out. Then they have to have the democracy, and then it turns out the Muslim Brotherhood, which has this connection to the street and the mosque, etc., winds up winning. Then the military is actually out of power for the first time. And I'm summarizing here, and tell me if I'm getting anything wrong here.
Yeah, the military wasn't out of power. They were always right behind the wall. They just basically said, you guys take over the executive branch, and we'll be right there. If the military withdraws its support, done.
So they still have the weapons, they still have the financial situation well in hand because they've got the macaroni factories, etc.
Right.
They just had lost the executive branch for
That's
a
right.
while, right?
That's right.
And so when Morsi started abusing his power a little bit, they're like, good, that's a good opportunity. Here we go, and they've regained the executive branch, and now they're fully in power.
Fully in power in every visible manner.
Right.
Though they still try to use rhetoric that makes them seem like they're not visibly in power.
Right. So now we have
pretty visible, though.
Right. Now we don't have a technical dictator like Mubarak, and we have softer rhetoric. But the same guys that were running Egypt before the 2011 election are basically back in charge.
Yeah, same sort of general community. I mean, the latest guy is a guy named Sisi, and he was actually educated in the United States, though he has had highly combative rhetoric with elements of the United States State Department since.
So actually, I lied. Before we get to social media, I'm going to insert that one more question since you brought that up. So how does the U.S. feel about all this, and where does al-Sisi lie with us, Israel, et cetera? Because how the U.S. feels probably is directly related to how Israel feels.
Yeah, I remember, listening to Democracy Now! Just shortly after the protests broke out. I was glued to Al Jazeera as well, and Chomsky came on Democracy Now! And he said, the United States, and this is okay to be honest about this, but we're not honest about this. We're not interested in quote unquote democratic values. I mean, depending on how you define democracy, I have my own ways of defining it. We are a democracy in some ways, and in other ways we're not. So what the United States is going to do here is based upon its own interests, protecting its own interests. Those interests, in some cases, might be highly antithetical to these democratic movements. So people know that in Egypt. People are pretty upset with the United States. I mean, this dates back, of course, to Palestine-Israel issues as well, and the Intifada. So, people basically see, Obama coming to Cairo and giving that talk, announcing to the Arab world a new way forward, a new covenant forward, as hypocrisy. That's how they see it. People see tear gas canisters being fired upon them that are manufactured in Pennsylvania a few months before they were fired, sold by the United States to the Egyptian military. They see that as the United States.
Pennsylvania's a mixed bag. We got Hershey chocolate, it's delicious.
Yeah.
And then we got those, smoke grenades. So, and that's, by the way, that microcosm is kind of exactly what America spreads across the world.
Yeah.
We like the McDonald's, we like the jeans, we like the chocolate.
Like the TV.
The bombs, not as much.
Yeah.
Not as much. But so al-Sisi, are we happy with them or no?
No, we're not at all. But we're not happy with any environment that doesn't necessarily protect the United States interests. So that doesn't. What we care about is the support of Israel, and for many reasons. And so long as there's sort of a stable sense that will occur, we're okay with things as they go for the most part. But that's not even that clear, because al-Sisi is seen as a strong leader who definitely engages in a lot of rhetoric that is combative with the United States since things happened. I mean, I can't take this image out of my head of a young man who's 18 years old. He had bandages all over his arms, and his eyes were like, one was mainly shut, holding up a grenade to me and saying, "Obama, why? Obama, why?" And this was a tear gas canister that hit him in the eye. Why would Obama fire this upon us? Yeah,
well, Obama, why is a cry heard not just across the world and in Egypt, but here as well. We didn't get the tear gas canisters, but we got a lot of different things we didn't expect. Okay.
Yeah.
Including record deportations, that the Latino community, his approval has gone from 80% to 55%. They're screaming, why? And the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
So now, social media. What you described about handing out the recorders and then showing it on the walls of their community, it's amazing, etc. But a lot of Egypt is not connected through social media. So that's a common misnomer. First, tell us about that, and then second of all, then if it's not that well connected, why are they using social media so much?
So at the time of the 18 days of protest in 2011, 5% of people in all of Egypt, actually 5% of people in Cairo had Facebook accounts, and under 1% had Twitter accounts. So those people who would be having access to those technologies are actually demographically similar to one another. They tended to be younger, upper middle class, and more educated, and generally speaking, more liberal in their sort of thinking.
Let me stop you there for a second. So, we're led to believe here in the U.S. is the Facebook revolution, et cetera. So if only 5% of the people in Cairo, let alone the rest of Egypt, the more sophisticated city, was connected on Facebook, how did all those people actually show up in the streets?
So these terms, social media revolution, are a big misnomer. But that doesn't take away from the fact that activists, those small numbers of people who were connected, didn't use those technologies in highly clever ways. So I'll just tell you a couple ways they did it. One is they used it to organize with one another. So that's something that's really important. That may not reach masses of people, but you use it to organize with one another in a country where if you met in person, as I've seen before in Kyrgyzstan, you would be assassinated or thrown in jail. These are what we call emergency laws. So that's one method. Second is they were very creative with who they got to follow them, not how many, who they got to follow them on Twitter. Why is that? Because if you can get people who are part of the mainstream media, who have masses of people in a country with high numbers of satellite televisions, high satellite TV penetration in Egypt, if you can get those people to follow you on Twitter or engage with you on Facebook or other social media platforms, you can amplify your message. So it doesn't become this echo chamber, which is really the critique. We use terms like walled gardens or echo chambers when we criticize social media platforms. It rapidly mutates out of the specifics of a social media platform and into the wider public. So that's the second way in which they were doing it.
So the seed is planted in social media, but then it goes to more traditional media from there. So from their Twitter accounts, they reach the TV producers, anchors, reporters, etc., and then they put it on TV, and then people show up.
And the seeds are not necessarily planted in social media. They might be planted through labor movements or various activist imaginaries, right? But they are initially introduced into what we call a media ecology. I'm being academic here, but a media ecology, the connections between older and newer media platforms, how they inform and create one another through these social media platforms, because they were not as easily policed at that time in Egypt, and that was a big part of it. I'll tell you one story. I was at a sit-in in a factory in Mahalla, which is where the labor movement comes out of in Egypt, dating back like 10 to 15 years. And there were 34,000 laborers occupying a giant textile factory in this, and they were protesting for various rights and values. And in that factory, there was one young guy who was only 23 years old. Most of these laborers were in their 40s. And he had a video camera. He was totally different in every way than all the sit-in laborers. He had a video camera, and then I sort of asked him, his name was Mohamed, why do you have this video camera here? And he took me into the other room, and he's like, because I'm recording these things and I'm blogging about them. And I said, well, these laborers are just talking about the price of tomatoes or a wage or whatever, and you are writing about it in such a way that challenges the authority of the regime. That's not what they're saying. He's like, well, that's the game of media. We take a particular story and we amplify it and spin it in particular ways. So the point is, these guys have channels and networks, and they're figuring out ways to create enough seductive stuff to get other people to report on it, probably in somewhat different ways. Because as we know, when we go on Facebook or YouTube or any social media platform, it's very hard to tell what is quote unquote truth. What we are doing is creating an outcry. And that outcry is in person, it's online, and it's also through older media platforms like television.
Let me talk about labor for 1 second, because the conventional wisdom here is that in 2011, it was a protest in the streets that toppled the government. Is that Is that a little off? Was it in fact the labor strikes that toppled the government more so than even the protests back then?
We talked about this on February 1st and 2nd. There were massive labor strikes across the nation, and that certainly is one major contributing factor that's not talked about when we talk about what actually was the toppling force. It's hard to isolate one factor.
Sure,
there were so many at play.
Yeah, it goes to my theory that it's always about the money, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you own a macaroni factory and all of a sudden you're not making money from that macaroni factory, then you're a little bit more motivated to move Mubarak out and put in a different figurehead so you keep making money at the macaroni factory. So in South Africa, apartheid goes down not because all of a sudden they felt a little bit more moral about the situation, but because basically the protest led to an economic blockade of sorts, and that hurt the upper class of South Africa, and that motivated them to change from apartheid. So it seems like hit them in the pocketbooks is the best way to go.
Yeah, and this is what I mean by how you use media to reframe and spin stories. The vast majority of people, again, with these social media accounts, have money. They're upper middle class. The vast majority of protesters don't have money. And when you talk to the vast majority of protesters, especially the guys in the front lines, like that young man who said, "Obama, why?" I asked him, "Why are you protesting?" And he doesn't talk about human rights. He doesn't talk about democracy. He doesn't talk about social justice, though he may have sympathy with some of those. He was talking to me about the ability for him to get married, because you have to pay the woman's family in that culture to actually have the marriage happen. Mm-hmm. He was talking about any form of employment, none of which he was able to access.
See, in our culture, you pay the woman after you get married. So it's a little different. Okay, so it's economic issues, of course, for the protesters as well as the people in power.
That's right.
So that's really interesting. So now, are they having a harder time than activists because that amplification might stop at the river's edge, because the guys who own the TV stations are part of the power structure, and when it was, when the situation was different, they might want to amplify that, but today they might not want to amplify that message.
And that's something that's really important, right? I mean, some of these major networks, we see sort of quote unquote Al Jazeera as being, a major force in these initial 18 days of revolution. Al Jazeera Arabic is very different than Al Jazeera English, which is also very different than Al Jazeera America. In fact, even the editorialization and the sort of political stances of these different networks, as you know so well, differs based on how the game is played by those different networks. So the activists, in terms of reaching those domestic audiences, they need to get the Arabic reporters to actually follow and amplify their voices. So many people say, to this day, they're very successful at getting the international media, people like yourself, to some extent academics like myself, to kind of amplify the things they're saying. All I'm doing in this interview is telling stories that they've told me through social media at this point. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's a major challenge to get that, to recirculate that back to your own audiences. So I agree. That's part of the new game strategy. And that's why sometimes they're turning to street level media activism that don't require, the wires of the internet. Remember, in most of the developing world, people will have one Facebook account for 20 people, or they will do what they call wire splitting in many parts of, urban slum regions. They'll take one, internet cable, and they'll figure out ways, because everywhere in the world, people know how to use, soldering guns and gum and toothpicks to kind of, they can repair your iPhone on the street wherever you go. But they can do the same thing with internet routing, right? So the idea of like one person per account, one nice computer per person, those are all myths that exist in the world. So they're figuring out ways to diffuse by using street culture.
So, look, I want to learn about Egypt. I also want to learn from Egypt. Yeah. So I want to conclude by figuring out what lessons we can learn, especially from the social media aspect here in the US. So our situation is both similar and different. Our mainstream media is also co-opted by the power establishment. They are the power establishment. It's not a matter of being co-opted. They're part and parcel, right? And so we have that same river's edge. But on the other hand, online reaches far deeper in the US than it does even in a country like Egypt. So what can we learn from the revolution in Egypt, the continuing fight in Egypt, and what has been used so successfully in social media circles in Egypt if we want to take on the power establishment here in the U.S.?
It's the killer question. I mean, it's an amazing question. At the end of the day, I think there are a couple points of learning. One is what people have been successful with, despite tremendous odds and a lot of money and power against them, has been in pushing against particular issues. So that's one place to start. It's really important for protest movements to gain some success over at least some small issues, because it gives the movement a lot of momentum, right? So I feel that one thing that could have occurred, and to some extent may have occurred out of the Occupy movement, which was highly social media penetrated, by the way, could have been very specific directed actions that we could have taken as protesters against some of the powers that be. So I think that there is a space here in the United States for some interests that are progressive to be supported by people through social movements. So I think to focus on specific topics and specific interests start to show chinks in the armor of the powers that be. Many people in the Arab world also are far more willing, and I don't mean this in a negative way, to put their bodies in harm's way. Partly because the straits are so dire, and I have a friend who's a female activist in Egypt, and she said, when the whole news of the PRISM scandal and Snowden came out, why are there not at least 30 million Americans in the streets right now? How many Americans are in the streets, throwing rocks at whatever? Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. One, we never go in the streets, and I think part of the answer is that we're too comfortable, and our couch is way too comfortable to walk out into the street. Number two, we've been conditioned to believe that if you throw a rock, you're a terrorist.
Right.
And so throwing a rock seems perfectly normal in the rest of the world. In America, it's seen as a really, really radical action. So, I think we've been conditioned to not go in that direction.
Yeah, I think the other issue is it's very difficult to visualize power in the United States, because power is sort of based on these particular types of, I would say, complicit connections between banks and military generals, and of course government officials who are paid by both, and so on. It's not as simple as that, but that's the complexity of it. In Egypt, it's very straightforward to see who the oppressor is. The oppressor is whoever it is that is beating you up on the street. In the United States, this is a far more challenging issue to identify, but there's a lot that we can learn from there. One of them is the fact that what we call as media studies scholars slacktivism. Many people who use social media for that sense of satisfaction that feels really great, but it's just really not really there. It's that sense that, oh, I clicked on that petition and passed it on, but nothing ends up happening at the end of the day. What they did, and they continue to do in Egypt, is move out of those media bubbles. They don't do that by saying, oh, social media is nonsense, it's useless. They realize how they can properly use it to interact with other ways of organizing, right? So they figure out ways to connect street-based protest, which we don't do enough of, I agree, with social media environments. They figure out ways to connect social media environments with progressive television channels that might exist in that country. So you have to build your groundswell across all of these connections, across all these networks.
I think one of our principal problems here in the U.S. is that we're the slowly boiling frog in the water. And so there was no okay, I'm coming in and I'm going to hit you over the head and I'm going to take power, right? It was, well, I bought that congressman there, and I, increase my ability to fund politicians a little bit more here and a little bit more there. And next thing you know, look at all these congressmen and senators that I gave legal donations to, right? And I hired their sons, and I hired them after they left. So when Evan Bayh leaves office in Indiana, and takes a job at Goldman Sachs, people don't go, let's hit the streets.
Yeah.
But that's a slow corruption.
Right.
And next thing you know, hey, every senator got the memo. When you leave, you're going to get millions of dollars from the banking industry. Make sure that you don't touch the banking industry. Yeah. It's hard to motivate people to go, okay, well then let's hit the streets, because they just brought up the temperature just 1 degree, and they keep bringing it up 1 degree. On the General Petraeus, when he retires, where does he go? He goes to KKR. Yeah. It's a private equity firm. Now, there's nothing nefarious in that particular action, right? He's an individual actor, and I'm sure that he means well by it, right? And they mean well by it, but what happens? They're far more likely to get government contracts. The government is far more likely to give them tax breaks.
It perpetuates these connections.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, in some sense, we have a harder challenge than Egypt does.
Yeah, I mean, some activists in Egypt tell me that things have to get really, really bad before people act in these sort of more sort of bodily ways, so to speak. I really think that the issue-driven campaigns are a great way to go here. I mean, it seems like we are having some successes with LGBTQ rights in this country, like that, perhaps.
So no,
Yeah.
we absolutely are, but that's an ironic success.
Yeah.
Because the LGBT community has more money than their opponents.
Right. So there's the money, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So there's the answer. Well, look, I've learned a lot from this.
Thank you.
And I think that for example, to take one of the things that you mentioned, that you could make an issue out of minimum wage and say, look, why are you, if minimum wage had kept up with American productivity, the American worker's productivity was awesome. And if it had kept up with it, right now it would be $20. Where did it go? Where's the difference between $20 and $7? It's not in your pocket, it's in somebody else's pocket. That's an economic issue that affects the protester. It's a specific issue, and it begins a rally, right? So that's a possibility.
I think there are two ways forward here. Just responding to this, I'm really appreciative that that you could give my work some voice and have this conversation with me. One is, we need better ways of visualizing what's happening to us. I mean, and I don't mean like cool infographics. I mean like ways in which we can understand like what it actually means when there's a record number of killing storms and climate calamities that are happening in the world, or even in this country, which is a little bit less. We need ways to visualize this and bring this thing home so it's here and now. That's the first thing. And the second thing, the real lesson in my work, because I'm a media studies scholar, is the power of looking locally when we think about social media, rather than prophesizing this in these like meta abstract ways, like social media revolution, digital divide. These things don't mean anything. The only important issue is to look at what communities do around the world, what activists do around the world, and how they intelligently don't get seduced by these mainstream narratives around technology, but they use the tools around them. That could be blankets, it could be stones, but it could be social media platforms, to create a better world for themselves.
It's amazing lessons that we've learned. Professor Ramesh Srinivasan, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Really appreciate it. Thank you, Cenk.